Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Mad Mamluks. My name is Sim. Along with me is my co-host Ismail Royer. Ismail, how you doing, man?
I'm doing beautifully.
And 2 days to your wedding and you are on a call with the Mad Mamluks and ready to record.
This is my bachelor party actually right here.
Oh yeah? So, for the listeners who don't know, who aren't on social media, why don't you tell us about a little bit about who you are actually marrying? Because she's a public person, and I don't think she would mind you letting the listeners know a little bit about her.
So, alhamdulillah, I'm getting married to Sister Noor Juda, or Goda as her name appears in English, and she's a well-known podcaster, alhamdulillah, and will be going on to many beautiful things, inshallah.
Yeah. Well, we'll save that whole story for another time, but I'm just really excited to be part of this with you guys. And I think, inshallah, me and Noreen, my wife, have so many du'as for you two to succeed and, start this new venture in your life. So,
I mean, thank you very much.
Yeah. Well,
and in fact, there's a lot of, you guys have a lot, I've had a big role in our meeting and everything, but that's a story that'll come out later, inshallah.
Yeah. We'll make it Love Buzz Part 2.
Yes. Exactly.
All right. So, let's introduce our guests that we have and tell us a little bit about each one of them, Ismail, as you met them on Twitter and other social media avenues that you may have come across them, and that way, some the listeners can get to know their background and get to know their voice as well.
So let me tell you how we got this group of brothers together here. When I got out of prison, I came out. It was a little bit isolated, and didn't really, most of the community had moved on and changed a lot. In the 13 and a half years that I was in prison, so I started getting on Twitter and just sort of like going out there and trying to put my views and opinion out there, as I've just sort of got a habit of doing, and came across an interesting group of brothers and sisters actually, and so I decided that it would be a cool podcast episode to bring some of these fine people together that I interacted with a lot on social media and learned a lot from, to try to replicate some of the interesting conversations that we'd had on Twitter and bring that into the airwaves, inshallah, as it were. So we picked some of the most interesting people. Actually, there's a good maybe 15 or more, 20 people we could have pulled from, but these are the brothers that were available, and we tried to get some sisters too, but they didn't want to do it. So inshallah, that we'll get them in later. So right now, okay. So first up, we got the brother AQ. Okay, so the brother AQ. Yes. Like I said, he's well known. All these brothers are well known on Muslim Twitter, but the brother AQ, he's an Oxford graduate in philosophy, politics, and he's currently at Cambridge. He's a grad student in philosophy and theology. So, AQ, why don't you tell us something about some of the things that you're interested in, some of the subjects that you study?
Sure. So at the moment, I'm a graduate student at Cambridge. So I'm studying both philosophy and theology, and so there's a mixture of both contemporary Western philosophy and also a lot of kind of Islamic kalam, and I'm kind of researching in both of those areas. My main interests are in epistemology, so the study of knowledge, particularly moral epistemology. So how, if at all, do we come to have moral knowledge, and how do we justify the moral beliefs that we have? And I'm particularly interested in kind of critically examining Imam al-Ghazali's positions and arguments relating to that. And that kind of really feeds into this whole politics thing, because all of our political beliefs are ultimately structured by what we think the fundamental moral values are. And so I'm very interested in seeing, how do we decide what moral values to believe? How do we justify our moral values? How do we know we've come to moral truth or not? Those are the sort of main issues which animate me.
Fascinating. Okay. Yes. All right. So definitely a lot to go into there. Then we've got Brother Hossam. The brother is an activist on the ground in New York City, in the New York City Muslim community. He started IMJ, the Islamic Muslims for Justice. Wait, no, is that right? Islamic Muslims for Justice.
The Islamic Movement.
Islamic Movement. Okay. Sorry, Islamic Movement for Justice. So the brother has launched a movement.
Why
don't you tell us more about yourself?
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum. My name's Hossam. I'm based in New York. And IMJ, or Islamic Movement for Justice, it's being restructured now actually, but it was a nonprofit I started with a group of other relatively well-known activists in the area to basically build an Islamic community that is politically knowledgeable, knows how to maneuver in the political atmosphere without making unnecessary compromises in the deen or in our material conditions. But I have done work outside of, specifically Muslim specific avenues. I've been involved in several campaigns for criminal justice reform. I've been involved in, Palestine. I mean, I consider that a Muslim issue as well, but Palestine solidarity work. I just got placed on the Canary mission recently.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Oh, God.
They got a really, really long page on. You can actually probably read it. Gives a good resume.
Yeah, maybe we can put a link to that on the.
All right, but yeah, so I graduated with a degree in psychology, but a lot of my focus in my schooling and and just general interests were in domestic and foreign policy and politics, as well as I delve into addressing issues like secularism, feminism, liberalism.
All right. Well,
I guess I'm a jack of all trades.
There's a lot to delve into with that. Inshallah,
Yeah.
We'll do that. Inshallah. Okay, now let's go to Haris. Haris, tell us about yourself. You're a current grad student at Oxford in international development, and you've got a lot of really interesting, excited things to say on Twitter. We all enjoy your posts. Why don't you tell us more about yourself and your interests?
Right. So, assalamu alaikum. I'm Haris. And so, as Brother Ismail said, I currently am a graduate student at University of Oxford in the International Development Department. Before that, I was at University of Toronto, where I studied international relations and Middle Eastern civilizations, where I focused on Ottoman history, as well as another minor in political science. And what interests me more, or my interests lie more in kind of empirical political science. And in that regard, a lot of international relations theory, well, that's not as empirical, but international relations theory and international relations practice, kind of theorizing and thinking about geopolitical practice, especially with regards to the Islamic world, and pre-modern or pre-Westphalian ideas about Islamic statecraft, Islamic ideas about sovereignty, and generally pre-modern ideas about sovereignty and statecraft. And my current interests focus more on Islamic finance, and especially with regards to global governance and alternative methods of financial institutions, especially in light of the last 30 years of financial crises, economic stagnation, economic problems, specifically in the developed world, and how Islamic finance poses new opportunities, new improvements, as well as new risks that need to be managed and need to be analyzed carefully. So I'm kind of an eclectic mix of things, but that's basically where my interests lie.
My God. Okay. Yeah. So there's definitely a lot to go into there as well. And then subhanAllah, we could spend, on every one of you brothers, mashallah, we could really spend a couple hours.
Yeah, I love the fact that he's in Ottoman history. Do you watch Arthurul on Netflix?
No, but I've heard amazing things about it, so I probably should get on that.
Yeah, because everyone wants to know the true story of Arthurul, and keep on mixing truth and fiction and legend. It would be amazing if you actually did some digging and found out what's actually going on, or what is actually truth from fiction with regards to
There
history.
really isn't any truth in it, though, because
Okay.
Hey,
Now
don't say
hold
that.
there. So we hold that thought. We've got
Don't break my
here-
dreams.
Yeah. Okay. Now, last but not least, we need a drum roll. Do we have an effect for a drum roll? Sim, add that in, man. Add the drum roll. Okay?
Oh, okay.
All right. Yeah,
I'm on it.
so we've got the famous Dimashqee, who is the provocateur on Twitter.
rabble rouser.
Yes, as I mentioned, I suspect he was actually a bot, but now we see him and he's an existing human being. Yes. So Dimashqee, you're a student in international relations and politics, and that's where you want to leave it. Can you tell us anything more about yourself without revealing too much of the mystery?
I'm quite a boring person, to be honest. I'm a scholastic. I like reading and researching all day. My interests lie in alternative paradigms. So it's not only about the Islamic world and Islamic civilization. I'm interested in the rise of China. So I'm currently doing a dissertation on the rise of China. And going back to, Harris talking about pre-modern ideas, I'm looking at how the pre-modern ideas of sovereignty and culture affect today's China in its quest for hegemony globally, and how that's going to affect international relations. And the main thing that I'm trying to take away from that is how we as Muslims, a lot of our politics of the past 100 years has been either to try and cheaply imitate the West in terms of, modernization and things like that, or, just like a knee-jerk reaction against anything that is westernization. So trying to find like a base we can build an independent civilizational discourse based off our own pre-modern Islamic tradition, and it's very rich. And I'm also researching that alongside China. And what I am hoping to do is sort of it's like hybridize a sort of Chinese confidence in their own beliefs, in their own place in the world, and try and get Muslims to imbibe some of that and to understand the sort of tools that the Chinese are using to climb to power. So it's not like, revolutions and provocations and wars. It's a slow and steady build of a war of position. They're building the economy, they're building the cultural output, and they're doing that with full sovereignty, while the Muslim world is really lacking in any sort of thought that could emulate the Chinese in terms of their independent outlook from the West. So if we look at the Muslim countries like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey to an extent, all of them are dependent on, Western discourse, Western understanding of politics, Western economics. And I'm just interested in trying to sever our dependence on the West in general.
So awesome. So I'm learning about you guys as the listener is, because for the listeners who don't know, these are all Ismail's friends, and they're his friends from social media and whatnot. So I'm just getting familiar with each one of you guys, and it seems like there's
friends and frenemies, actually.
well, there's a common theme among all you guys, right? It seems like you guys are focused or fixated on Islamic thinking. It seems like there is the notion that the Western Muslim has become has gotten its hooks in, or their mind has got their hooks into Western thoughts and ideologies rather than Islamic thought. Is that a correct assumption, or would you guys beg to differ?
There's definitely there's a tipping point right now where the Muslim community I feel like has to make a decision on what direction it wants to head in the West, right? I'm going to talk specifically in the U.S. context because I'm sure it's different in the U.K. But what direction are we going to go? Are we going to assimilate And if we do assimilate, how do we assimilate? Or are we going to radically alter what exists currently, in like a reformation? Or are we going to motivate a revolution, not literally a revolution, but revolution in thinking or ideas or in institutions in the West? I think this is the tipping point at this moment, as what we thought was stable before Western civilization was stable before, with the coming of people like Donald Trump, etc., and the hysterics that's going on. Now is the perfect opportunity to address this specific point. And I think like, for me, I always harken back to Islamic orthodoxy in terms of how do we...
Now, a lot of your detractors would say, the previous Islamic movements have already tried this. The Hizb ut-Tahrir and Ikhwan al-Muslimin, they've tried to remove people from, pan-Arab nationalism and Western thought and philosophy. What makes this era different with young men like you guys?
I mean, the main issue with groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir is, going back to what I said earlier, in essence, what they do is they just ape, the Western understanding of what the state is, what its role is. So they take Western institutions and its apparatus and they, in essence, Islamify it. So if we take the Western separation of powers, they just say, okay, we too have separation of powers. We have Islamic judiciary and Islamic legislative body, and so on and so forth. So it's not really a holistic response to modernity. It's an attempt to Islamify modernity itself. That's always going to fail. The Muslim Brotherhood is actually the same thing, because Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, he was against the Muslim, he created it to be a social grassroots organization for bottom-up change. He was against the idea that we could capture the state and use it to Islamify society, because he understood that states could never be Islamified. It could never be used to bolster the faith, because at its very essence, it is Western and it is built for a secularized, atomizing society, and that is antithetical to the Islamic paradigm, as it were.
Okay, let me. I want to ask you guys something, because there's been one of the criticisms of so-called Islamic movements, in contemporary times, is that they essentially accept, and I think you alluded to this, they accept the concept of the state being essentially the prime mover of everything that happens with society. So they accept this role of an all-powerful state penetrating into the lives of everyone, and this is this is the idea that seems to be motivating most Islamic movements. But is that really true to not only human nature, but then also the way that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the Muslims of the past operated? So does anyone want to take that up?
Yeah, I think it builds off perfectly off the last two questions and on what Dimashqee said, and I think this is recognized in a lot of academic scholarship, but it's not an idea that has kind of filtered through to the general public or to most people, which is that the state as we know it is not a natural construction. Likewise, the market as we know it is not simply a manifestation of people just doing what they want and it naturally arises. Likewise, the state is also not just a natural, as we know it, is not just a natural consequence of humans interacting, but rather it is something that was constructed on purpose with specific political choices. It was created by design. And I think that's where a lot of these previous Islamic movements not fail, well, maybe fail, but where they fall short is that they So as Dimashqee mentioned, they kind of seek to Islamify modernity rather than have a response or an alternative paradigm to modernity. And in that way, they basically accept as a given that states and markets are merely these kinds of natural outgrowths that simply exist, throughout time and space, which I don't think is historically accurate, and any common scholarship on the topic would attest to that, that these are not natural, innate aspects of human organization. And so we need to kind of recognize that, where I think that's a major shortcoming in a lot of Islamic movements of the past century.
Could I add to that?
Yes,
okay?
yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is AQ. So I think Haris is absolutely right. One of the major problems is that even amongst Muslims, we've so internalized these Western values and Western concepts as they relate to the nation state. But I think it's actually broader than that. It's not just that we've so badly internalized Western concepts and Western values when it comes to the nation state, but it's absolutely across the board in every area relative to politics, and also every area relating to social conduct and individual life. And so what I hope to do in a very small way in my research is, now this is not really something which can directly filter down to the masses, but at least amongst kind of the intelligentsia amongst the Muslims, if I can kind of convince them by engaging with Western philosophy and Western political theory, by trying to deconstruct, like academically from within the paradigms of Western thought, their own value structures and their own conceptual schema, and within the paradigms and the rules and methodologies of Western philosophy and Western political science, if I can use that to sort of justify why actually the kind of classical values and classical political concepts from our own Aqidah, if I can show them to be strong and compelling on those grounds. Because I think one of the major reasons why these movements fail is because they just don't have buy-in amongst well-educated Muslims. Well-educated Muslims are convinced by things like liberal political theory and political theory to do with nation states. So I think
I don't know about that, to be honest.
You don't think so?
The Islamist groups, whether they're in Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, they have a very strong middle, even sometimes upper class educated cohort. So I think I would go back to what you were saying before this point, in that even though they are educated, they tend to be, so deeply indoctrinated, and the education systems are so conditioned to inherently believe that the Enlightenment,
that's
modernity's
exactly
concept of the state is the default good base. Everything else on top of that is just something that we can add on that say Islam is better in that sense, that we can add on to your tradition, and that's the issue.
Now let me bring in Hossam, if you don't mind, because I wanted to ask him, and he might see my point on this. That assuming that theoretically all this is correct, what are we supposed to do when things happen in the world and we want to try to fix it, or we want to try to contribute to a solution to that, and the only way that we have to do that is the way that our society allows for, right, Hossam? I mean, like it's all well and good to say, and by the way, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, but it's all well and good to say that this, the state is as a sort of fictional construct, or I don't want to say fictional, but it's not something that necessarily has to exist, and et cetera, et cetera. But then, like, what do we do about important issues that come up in our life, right? I mean, Hossam, what would you say about that?
So I would actually say that if we actually look at the state structure and how it has evolved or developed, is that what we have now is that the state is heavily influenced by non-state actors, right? And I think this is an opportunity for Muslims to take advantage of, for example, in not necessarily always having to, buy into a system or buy into the nationalist system or the nation state system, and kind of take a more out of the box approach towards shifting, the status quo, right? And when I say by that is like, when it comes to our local community, when it comes to the global Muslim community has a direct connection towards towards our local Muslim communities, because it's our governments and it's our tax dollars and it's our money that goes into our government's militaries, our government's foreign policies, our government's allyships that oppress our Muslims overseas. Now, what we can't do is be like thinking we have to vote, we have to participate in this in such a way that, and a presumption that this will eventually lead to a change in policy, right? What we have to do is we have to start radically thinking outside of this paradigm, this nation state paradigm. And that doesn't mean, I'm not saying I have the answers, right? What I'm saying is that dialogue has to begin, where we have to stop, boxing ourselves in, right? And a lot of people are scared to do that because when they hear things like non-state actors, what they think of, and Muslim, they think of like terrorist groups, right? Or like ISIS or what have you. But we have to get out of that inferiority complex and actually start, addressing the flaws in the approach of going through the state structure towards shifting the straight. Like, a system is not going to provide a whole in which that you can access that will delegitimize that system. Like, you can't, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, it doesn't make sense to presume
a system doesn't allow a mechanism that would allow it to defeat itself or to
exactly. Yeah, there's no self-destruct button that is inherent in the system, right? So what you have to start doing is we actually have to start building from the grassroots level and building a community that is self-dependent and does not become dependent on a state structure, right? And I think in that way, it reminds me of the ayah in the Quran that says, Allah doesn't change a condition until you change what is in yourself, to change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. And, that can be interpreted in many, when I mean interpreted in many different ways, like traditionally interpreted in many different ways. I think one way we could look at that is that if we start becoming more self-dependent and stop relying on a state structure to provide for us what we want for ourselves, then Allah will provide that avenue. Allah will provide us that direction towards, actually being able to tackle the more global issues as well, right?
That's an interesting point because, would that be a way to avoid the, let's say, excess penetration of the state into our lives, to just sort of develop, or to try to disengage? I mean, how do you disengage from, I have to go to DMV and I have to, the Department of Motor Vehicles to get my driver's license, and then I have to register my car, and then I have to get my insurance, then I have to, that basically, how do you do that? I mean,
well, I'm not saying you disengage immediately, right? But this is obviously a long-term process, right? But I think,
and wait, I don't think you're talking about it on that granular level as well either. You're not talking about, not paying your taxes and things like that. I think what you're intending to say is that seeking to find the solutions of societal problems through state structures. Isn't that what you're trying to say?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, for example, you want a Sharia compliant state, you're not going to get a Sharia compliant state. So instead of focusing on trying to get a Sharia compliant state, focus on building a Sharia compliant community, right? A Sharia compliant that utilizes zakat in a way that is wealth distribution, that helps that local community, and that starts building a movement, right? And that's why I'm really focused on the grassroots level, on building a movement, because the movement doesn't have to be a political movement in that sense. It could be a grassroots movement, a communal movement, where if, just like we get inspiration from Muslim groups outside of the country, like Muslim Brotherhood, what have you, other Muslims around the world can get inspiration from what we do here. And, just because we don't directly affect them, you could indirectly impact, shifts within those countries where, what Dimashqee was talking about, where you have the Chinese, they have a more self-sufficient, conceptualization. That's what you can start building, globally as well. If you start from locally, you have to start building locally.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. Now, AQ, would you say, listening to Hossam, what Hossam is talking about sounds not too different than a lot of the type of movements and active. I mean, just the very notion of a movement, is that not itself? Would you say that that sort of, violating or not violating, but sort of against the spirit of what you're talking about is something pre-modern? You know what I mean? And by the way, when I listen to Hossam, this is very natural to me because I, grew up in America. I grew up in the West, and that's how we have always solved things through the abolition movement and these different things. So I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Hossam, but that's kind of what I understand. So is that something that you would say is sort of going against the spirit, the pre-modern spirit, and are we too captured by modernity?
So yeah, I think I'd probably say a couple of things in response to that, to what Hossam was saying. I think firstly, whilst it does go against the pre-modern spirit and it's not ideal, given that these structures are so dominant and we're forced to work within nation-state structures, I think what Hossam was saying and the kind of movement he's suggesting is, at least in the short term, something that's going to be necessary. There's no way, it doesn't even make kind of conceivable sense to talk about a non-nation-state pre-modern way to bring about political change today, because just those avenues, it doesn't even make sense to talk about those avenues because just those very structures don't exist. We're dealing with very different kind of socio-political structures which need to be affected, and they can only be affected within other existing socio-political structures. So that would be my first response, that at least in the short term, something that, like what Hossam is saying, is necessary. But my second response would be, in the long term, we can aim better than that. I think it's ultimately going to be very hard to succeed within the organizational and ideological structures of what we're against. The reason being, those organizational and ideological structures have grown up around buttressing and in codependence with what we're against. And this is why I think the way that we can have long-term change is through some sort of intellectual movements, where we say that even on the terms of Western philosophy and Western political theory, that even on those terms, we already have sound arguments we can make, which basically show why they're wrong and show why they're flawed and show why actually what we have and what we've always been able to offer is actually, even by their own terms, very sound and compelling. This will probably have two effects if we start pushing for this kind of intellectual change. One is it would at least soften the Western intelligentsia towards what we're suggesting. Right? So currently, there is no buy-in whatsoever amongst Western intelligentsia, Western elites, for anything we want to do. If we can at least soften them and say, okay, yeah, this is an intellectually plausible, this is a morally plausible, to some degree morally desirable alternative, if we can win off a certain percentage of, I'm not saying convert them to Islam, but convince them that this is an intellectually and morally serious movement. If we can have some segment of Western intelligentsia on our side and saying, yeah, okay, things which are radically different to the modern nation-state paradigm are things we should be looking into, this then suddenly opens a voice for us at the elite level of discourse.
So,
but also,
wait, can I just
go ahead.
Okay, so
wait, who's that?
This is Hossam.
Okay.
I want to interject. I want to kind of clarify. So when I'm thinking like grassroots movement, I'm thinking of something like the Nation of Islam with proper Islamic, orthodoxy, right? And what they were building, right? Like that type of community they were building a very self-sufficient community. It was a very powerful community, and it attracted so many people to it who were not even Muslim initially, or not even believers in necessarily the theology, but it attracted them to the Nation of Islam because of what the Nation of Islam provided. Right, provided people, what it was able to provide people on a material level as well.
Yeah. When you were talking, I heard as you were explaining, building the Islamic society, I heard like themes of Malcolm X. Am I right?
Yeah. Oh no, I'm very heavily pro and influenced by Malcolm X.
But he would be considered an extremist or fundamentalist, even though it's fashionable and cool to talk about Malcolm X. If he was in this day and age, he would be considered a radical Islamist, right?
Yeah, I know. I agree absolutely, and I think Muslims have to get away from that fear already. We cannot move forward unless we get away from the fear of what people will think of us, right? And I think going back to AQ's point about the intellectual challenging the Western construct intellectually, before we can do that, we need to prove it materially. Right, I want to prove that it works even on a
so
local level.
Hassan, can I respond to that?
Yes.
So I think your Nation of Islam example is very telling here, because it doesn't matter how large and how successful the Nation of Islam got, it was still an organization which is fundamentally bound by, for instance, governed by the nation state, but governed by their laws, their judiciary, and so forth, still forced to be within the economic structures of modern capitalism. It couldn't escape that.
Actually, more than that, this is Ismail. More than that, it was also, as a movement, very much an American style movement. You know
it was,
yeah. I mean, it's the kind of thing that's like, yes, it's sort of counter to the establishment and sort of offering an alternative to the establishment, but that's also an American tradition. I mean, look at the Amish. Look at there are many types of movements that sort of created these sort of alternatives. And so actually, I was gonna say, let me bring in Haris here, because I wanted to ask you. What are we talking about here? Like, when you listen to this conversation, are we talking about the Muslims in the West? Are we talking about Muslims in the Muslim world? And then look at Turkey, for example. Turkey seems to be what everyone kind of thinks is the sort of grand hope for moving forward in the Muslim world to something a little bit better than what we've seen in the past. And I don't want to put any words in anyone's mouth, but like, Turkey doesn't look like it's moving away from the nation state at all, actually. So,
Right.
What practical use is any of this discussion anyway? So go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, I think there's a few things that can be said. Going back to a point actually that Hossam made earlier about a system not having kind of a self-destruct mechanism within it. I think, and not to keep piling more onto the same theorists, but in the Muslim world, a lot of the Islamic movements of the past, this was their main conceit. They thought that if you Islamified the material trappings of modernity, the nation state, the markets, they thought if you Islamified it, that was in essence, the self-destruct, this would be the trump card, that we could just take whatever they're doing and then just make it better by making it Islamic, and that would be the victory. And of course, this type of thinking existed more in the past, but existed in Egypt, in Syria, in Iran.
Isn't this an inheritance from the late Ottoman Empire, by the way? The collapse of the Ottoman Empire essentially devolved into tiny nation states, right? With the absolutist state penetrating everything. Isn't that sort of a legacy of that, or am I misunderstanding that?
Well, I think it has various kind of intellectual origins. Like we can start with people like Tahtawi, who is kind of immediately in the aftermath of the Napoleonic years, where there was a lot of theorists who kind of saw, and then of course Al-Afghani, Ridda, people like that. And
I think we may have lost Haris.
Oh, can you not hear me?
No, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear him.
You can hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear
Perfect.
you, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so it came from kind of, I don't know if it came specifically from an encounter, if it came from the Ottoman Empire's changing internal structure itself, as opposed to more the kind of closer encounter with Western European modernity. Insofar as there was conquest and war and kind of a losing of ground in Dar al-Islam, broadly conceived. So I think that's where a lot of it comes from.
If I could butt in on that point.
Yeah, sure.
Or the Ottoman Empire. A lot of the trends of modernization along westernization did begin with the Ottoman state in the early 19th century. So when it came to not only the army but the law code, they tried to reform their local code to be in line with the European system, the Napoleonic system. So we had the Majalla, which was the codification of the Hanafi fiqh Sharia. And also administratively, they definitely did try to intensify and emulate the nation state structure, but they didn't have success with that really until, even Abdul Hamid II, he was actually one of the sultans that most successfully used the nation state apparatus to solidify the Ottoman control over the territories that were remaining. But even he himself struggled because the Ottoman Empire was poor. It was extremely rural, and the people obviously resisted the attempts to emulate the nation-state penetration in the Muslim lands that the Europeans had already gone through. So I would say that modernization occurred in places such as the capitals and the large cities like Izmir. We had Thessalonica in Greece, which was under the Ottoman Empire at the time, and obviously Istanbul itself. But outside of that, Ottoman attempts to penetrate its own territories using nation-state copycat institutions was largely a failure, and it was not until the Europeans defeated the Ottoman Empire, carved it up, created their colonial states, that modernity finally penetrated every substrata of society.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. If I can actually build off that once again, I think it's kind of it was in a way, in some ways, it was a kind of precursor to the failure of the movements of the 70s and beyond, which is that the very first attempt, as Dimashqee mentioned, the very first attempt to create this kind of Islamic modern nation state ended in war, in defeat, ultimately defeat, and extinction. The extinction of that polity was the result, ultimately, of these attempts. And of course,
you mean with the final implosion of the Ottoman Empire after World War One? Is that
yes, yeah. Yes. And I think exactly this speaks to kind of the problem, however, that faces us. So though I may, from here say that it's very conceited for Khomeini or al-Afghani to have believed that they could Islamify modernity, and then that would be the trump card. Connecting that to what you mentioned about Turkey earlier is that in some ways the question is brought up of what other choice does one have if one wants to have even some type of semblance of a successful or powerful or influential state that can protect Muslims, that can promote Islam. And how can that be done? A lot of questions will be raised about how can that be done in the current context outside of a nation state. And if you look at something like Turkey, or a place like Turkey, they are, not moving away, of course, from the paradigm of being a nation state whatsoever. In fact, they are asserting their sovereignty, and they're asserting their ability to govern their own affairs in a categorically, modern nation state building way.
And by the way, not to compare Turkey to ISIS in any way, but even ISIS, they created their structure. It looked exactly like a nation state, or at least
definitely.
they were trying.
Didn't they have Baathists in their ranks, basically organizing and institutionalizing it?
Yeah, I don't think that was that much of an impact. I think a lot of the understanding of ISIS was not simply a rejection of the world. It was an attempt to establish a sort of Sunni nation state in the same way that they considered everyone else had got one. The Christians got it, the Shiites had got it. So their cause was the Sunni state. And in, true nation state fashion, other minorities were annihilated. So, the Yazidis and the Shiites and even the Christians and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I mean,
good point. And by the way, and they even had like a council of ulama, which is like what Iran has, which by the way, the Muslims, the Muslim empires did not have.
All of their structures were the same. So you have, the so-called Islamic Republic of Iran, ISIS, all these sort of attempts to create a state in modernity. They're all linked. Their institutional organization is linked, and all of it is like its essence comes from the West. Even the most reactionary of forces don't seem to be able to produce a unique political organization outside of the Westphalian state tradition.
Yeah, actually, to add on to Dimashqee, I mean, people think of ISIS as this anomaly, but if you consider the history of the establishment of several nation states around the world, many of them came about through immense violence that mirrors what ISIS is doing. And
Nearly every single nation state had like just genocide of minorities.
Exactly. So the only thing that's different about ISIS now is that they're just starting later than everybody else, and so it just seems more barbaric. But this is how the U.S. was established. This is how, with the eradication of the Native Americans, this is how Australia was established, South Africa initially. This is how all these nation states were established in some way, shape, or form, was through the
If I may jump in, Hossam.
Yeah.
Your examples there were white settler states, which, of course, I mean, personally, I would probably group those into maybe a separate category. Of course, that
sure,
no less violent or no less homogenizing, but maybe in a separate category. But if we were maybe even to go to the kind of archetypal nation state, which would be France,
that's
they took the better part of almost 2 centuries to basically exterminate culturally, linguistically, any other group, any other language.
Any other dialect other than Parisian dialect?
Yeah.
And Burgundians, Britons, all gone.
Yep.
And if I could jump in as well, yeah.
Sorry, one last thing. That was, one of the major functions of public schooling, secular public schooling, because, the parochial school, the school of the church, people would learn their own language there. So say if it was in, the Basque regions, the priest would be Basque, the education would be in Basque, and that was such a major function of the secular public school, which was to take kids away from their language, take kids away from their traditions, take kids away from the things that their families and their church had taught them, and basically eventually with the end goal of ridding themselves of that culture entirely, turning the people who lived in the kingdom of France into Frenchmen. And that was not an easy process or a peaceful process whatsoever. Yeah. And that is the archetypal state, of course. That's the one that, is idolized and lionized in many ways in kind of the Western liberal canon. Yet it took an immense amount of violence to forge that state in the way it is today.
AQ here. I was just going to add to that the reason why you see it over and over, the reason why Europe has nation states, Europe and European settlers have nation states in the first place, and the reason why you have such a trend of this kind of homogenization and kind of violence exclusivity going on, I think it gets really down to the deepest hearts of kind of Europe's own kind of very political core, because it's had this kind of exclusivist and homogenizing drive from the very beginning. So you have the Catholic Church's belief in extra ecclesiam nulla salus, forgive my horrible mispronunciation of the Latin, which basically means outside of the church there is no salvation. What this meant in Europe is that if you weren't integrated into very specific ecclesiastical structures, if your government wasn't integrated into them, if your local community wasn't integrated into them, if you as an individual weren't integrated into them, you were damned to eternal hell and there was no going out of that. And this really began a very exclusivist drive that you had to belong to this, otherwise you had absolutely no rights, in very stark contrast to the Islamic model of Dhimma, where we were religious minorities in our own land. And this kind of trend continues in European history, where after the 30 Years' War, you get the principle of whoever is the ruler, it is his religion. Where basically
Can we get a sense of timeline there?
So extra ecclesiam nulla salus comes in the first millennium. It's extremely early. It's
literally 2,000 years of just exclusivist homogenizing drives.
Yeah, so that's I mean, literally Northern Europe is in a large part founded by the Catholic Church, and this is one of their driving principles. This inevitably leads to clashes like religious wars, which to some degree the 30 Years' War was, right? Because if you have this belief that only one religious group is allowed to survive, then that's inevitably going to lead to conflicts like, to some degree, the 30 Years' War was. And that's why you then needed compromises like coius regio, oius religio, once again, forgive my Latin pronunciation, which is whoever is the ruler, it is that religion. And so when you had Europe divided into all of these different states and principalities, you then had these often very brutal homogenizing drives where only one religious grouping was allowed. And this is what really led the kind of foundation of nation states, because you had all of these now homogenized pockets all across Europe, And this is completely alien to our tradition, right? We never had massive wars, which the way that we solved them was by allowing various rulers to just completely religiously homogenize their population, setting precedents to do that ethnically as well. We just don't have that. And this is why Europe's very political heart is so alien to our tradition. It just doesn't.
Until the Young Turks and the Armenian massacres, right? Wasn't that sort of the beginning of that sort of modernization of the Muslim world and beginning with that genocide?
I mean, there were tremors of that before, actually. In the it started off with the Greek revolt and establishment of their states in the 1820s. So that was the first effects of nationalism, and there was huge massacres of Muslims there in Greece, just like tens of thousands of them, annihilated by Orthodox priests riling up peasants against the Turk, against the Muslim. And this just continued to grow and grow and balloon. So we had massacres of Muslims across the Balkans. And even then it was small scale. It intensified in the 1870s when the first big Balkan Wars happened. So Serbia, Bulgaria, all those other states, they joined in, they created their nation states. And then we also had Russia coming in the Caucasus. And there are some really crazy statistics for the Caucasus. So the Caucasus, before the turn of the 20th century, it was very heterogeneous. It had mixed communities, Christians, Jews, Muslims. And the Russians came into that region. 90 to 95% of the Muslims in, Circassian Muslims, they were annihilated by the Russians. And the survivors of those people, they fled to Turkey, Anatolia, and they would then go to the Balkans when the Balkans were rebelling. They wanted to have revenge against what they saw was, this united Slavic Christian nationalist front slaughtering Muslims. So we have these Bulgarian horrors, the Red Turk and so on and so forth. And they really used this propaganda against Muslims, saying that we slaughtered our minorities and so on. But really what it was the territorial logic of the Westphalian state. It was the European ideologies of nationalism and religious exclusivism that started off this round of slaughter that eventually ended in World War I. World War I was not an anomaly. It was the culmination of all this violence that we are seeing in the 19th century. And after World War I, all these areas in the Balkans, in Anatolia, in the Caucasus, these were, heterogeneous. They were massively mixed. Each of these areas, so Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, they become, for the most part, homogeneous. And that's literally within 50 years. So imagine communities living side by side under the Islamic paradigm for 1,000 years. And within 50 years of European Enlightenment modernity's penetration into our, microcosm, all these genocides and bloodsheds and homogenization occurs. And, they've been laying it into us for the past 100 years, saying that we are a violent religion and we abuse our minorities. And, the history's there.
Wait.
But then, when the Muslim countries and the Muslim lands did incorporate that into their worldview or their outlook and their governments, there were those sort of pogroms and as well, were there not? Like I mentioned, the Armenians, and there were
absolutely, but that was a direct result of, because the Young Turks.
Or the brother mentioned ISIS. The brother mentioned ISIS, and then the sort of extermination of the Yazidi and the Christians and that type.
Yeah, so it's literally become political logic all around the world.
Right.
Because the Westphalian state now dominates everything. Yeah. Before the 19th century, it was just in Europe. But with colonialism and the European empires covering 80% of the world's surface by the 1920s.
AQ here. If I could just jump in. So this is why I think ultimately, whilst things like what Hossam are pushing for are very useful in the short term, the more important goal is to find, so for his Nation of Islam example, that's still something which is going to be bound by the governance of the nation states. or the formation of capitalist subjects and all of these other things which inevitably result in so much violence, materially, psychologically, culturally, and so forth. We need to have some way where we can open up on the kind of deep structural level alternative models to these structures. Otherwise, the kind of human atrocities that we keep seeing, we're not going to be able to escape them, because it's so, as you keep saying, it's so inbuilt into the territorial logic and the ideological logic of these various systems.
So when I was using the Nation of Islam example, it's not to say this is the end all be all thing that you emulate, right? I'm talking about a starting point, right?
Yeah, I agree.
And before we talk about academically challenging things, first you have to get the Muslims on board to begin with, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you mentioned something earlier, which was that this isn't our history, right? Our history was never like that. But the thing is, many Muslims don't know that. What we're taught is that all religions are the same. All religions have the same history as Christianity, and or Catholicism. All religions, they have the same bloody history. They have the same logic, right? And I think this is where the Nation of Islam model, I'm not saying emulate it entirely, but I'm saying what they were doing was building a self-sustaining mentality, right? Where they're like, we're going to build for ourselves, right? We're not going to be depending on others. So what I mean by that is through education, through our businesses, through everything, and building that, and so we create that identity with Islam.
They're still dependent on everything, though, right? They're still dependent.
Of course, but you can't. The thing is, right now, at the moment, realistically speaking, you can't at all. Like, we can't begin separating entirely, right? We have to begin from a starting point that develops into the separation. So I think the starting point is that we need to actually get Muslims in a mental state,
I absolutely agree,
identification where they actually identify with that goal, right? And they identify with that through their religion, and they understand their history, and they understand how we got to where we are, right? To begin with, right?
Ismail, just listening to these guys, I'm seeing like old school Ikhwan talking to old school Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Well,
because Hizb ut-Tahrir said like, no, you can't be dependent on institutionals. You have to change the government structure or the state structure. And Ikhwan would say, no, you have to build society from ground up through community building and so on, right?
I'm Egyptian, so I probably do get a lot of Ikhwani influences.
Any of you guys Palestinian? They would know the Hizb ut-Tahrir model.
I mean, why can't we have both, We have working at a grassroots level, and then some of us working, as like liaisons to the state structures. We don't necessarily need to try to capture the state, but we do need to be aware of it, aware of what it's doing, what its plans are for us. We need to be able to develop some kind of clout and diplomacy to push back or to influence some parts of it, and so on and so forth. At the same time, we do build parallel structures.
I don't think. I don't think you're going to be able to convince the Western intelligence. Like, I don't think you can convert the Western intelligentsia to Islam. But what I think there's a very real possibility. In fact, I think it's more probable than not. Over the next few decades, you can convert them out of liberalism. You can convert them out of nation statism.
Definitely.
You can convert them out of capitalism.
Absolutely.
And that's where our opportunity lies, right?
That's why we're different from the Hizb ut-Tahrir and Muslim Brotherhood. We have opportunities now that they don't.
We can be the ones which convert them out of that. And we can, even if we don't convert them to Islam or don't even get close to that, we can control the ways and capture the ways we convert them out of liberalism in ways that completely open up space for alternative, coexisting paradigms which are non-liberal, non-capitalist.
And the other thing that we have an advantage of that the Ikhwan and Hizb ut-Tahrir did not have is that we have the opportunity of education and access to educated people, right? And I mean like advanced education. So, you have people who can gain the knowledge to actually develop, alternative economic theories or alternative systems that you do not have in a lot of Muslim majority countries because of state repression. Not to say that in the U.S., not to sing praises of the U.S. or the West or what have you, but like this is actually an opportunity that we have that they don't have. So what you usually have is like you'll have the grassroots people working by themselves and you have the academics working by themselves, right? But what we have the opportunity for us here is that you have the the scholars having access to the scientists, to the doctors, to the grassroots activists, and you have a cohesive movement, right? And this is what I mean by movement. It's like a cohesive thing where it's like it's not marred by a very blindsided, biased, specialization. It's like no, it incorporates all facets. Right? It's multifaceted, right? And I think that's what we've been missing. And like what you usually have is just have the grassroots people do their own thing, the activists do their own thing, the scholars do their own thing, and the academics do their own thing.
To throw a word, perhaps maybe of pessimism into specifically, I guess what AQ said, is that just to throw a little wrench in there. One of the challenges, and I know that there is that you might be familiar with as well, a talk by Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad on this is the whole idea of riding the tiger of modernity. Or trying to control modernity, or pose a counterweight or an alternative paradigm to it. But the one challenge that comes up against is that a lot of academics you meet, you can tell them here are like alternatives to like liberalism, capitalism, nation state, to Whiggery, and they'll be like, oh well, I'm not any of those things. I'm a post-structuralist, I'm a postmodernist, I'm a Marxist, a neo-Marxist. Right, and not to throw these words about liberally, but broadly speaking, these are the traditions of the Western academia at the moment. And
I dispute that those things are really nearly as fundamentally different from what already exists.
I agree. Of course, I think it's obviously an outgrowth of modernity and modernist thought. However, it becomes more difficult to challenge the root of modernity if these people themselves don't believe that what they are doing or what they believe is modern or modernist rather. Yeah. And I think that poses kind of unique challenge where you can say, well, going back to what Dimashqee was mentioning as well, you can say, well, look, Islam has this history of tolerance towards minorities, of this non-homogenizing drive, whereas Christian civilization, Western civilization, you guys don't have that. You guys have this, violent history. Well, a common response from the intelligentsia and, even amongst fairly average people will be like, oh, well, I don't identify with that anyway. I don't identify with that, that Western civilization. I don't believe in any of that. So there's this new global culture, which is a bit, there's a new globalist culture or non-culture that's, deterritorialized, deculturated. Sure. That is very problematic to pin down in a way that we can critique it coherently.
So could I just jump into that for a second?
Yeah.
So basically what I would say is that I think it's very easily possible to, and this is something that I'm actually aiming to do in my research, is to point out that these people who see themselves as, oh, we're not modernist, or we're not, we don't belong, like you said, they see themselves as post-structuralist or postmodernist or outside of the Enlightenment tradition, is that I think it's very easy to say, actually, no, you are within that tradition. And the way you do that is that you just pose to them some very simple questions to do with their value systems. Because when you really push their value systems a little bit, it very easily reveals itself to be ultimately one and the same thing. And you ask themselves, and I think I've tweeted about this, let me just see if I can get up. Yeah, so you just like ask them like a few like very, very kind of straightforward questions, right? So you say, well, if you can ask them and say, so when you think about your political values and what you support, you're always invoking the language of freedom and equality and individual autonomy and freedom from direct harm, right? You're always invoking these set of concepts. Everything you say can always be reduced to this set of concepts, right? And this is something that they would happily accept, right? You can look at it in any major social or economic or geopolitical hot button issue of the day or cultural issue of the day. When you pose it to these people, they will always invoke this language of, this is about individuals should be free to be who they are or act how they want, or all human individuals, no matter what no matter what identity they have or what preferences they have, or equal, and so on and so forth. And so you can ask them a few questions like, why, when you invoke concepts like freedom and equality, are you invoking them under your conceptions? Why not an alternative conception? Why do you believe this conception is correct? Or furthermore, why do you believe under any conception freedom and equality are good things? Or why do you believe that these concepts are ultimately exhaustive of what matters in politics. Why is it only these things which matters to politics? You just posted them these very, very simple, straightforward questions. And then you realize that, or they will realize that they don't actually have any good answer beyond their own gut feelings. And then you say, well, that your gut feelings or your intuitions, as philosophers like to falsely call them, are really just a product of the Enlightenment. The same thing that you love to decry. Actually, it's just, you just share exactly the same kind of moral gut feelings as all these other people coming out of the Enlightenment have. You once again have no answers to these fundamental questions about your values. You're just taking. Yeah.
So AQ, I have a question. Would you say that, I actually agree with AQ, like now is an opportunity that you could snatch it, right? Like now an opportunity opens up. As because of postmodernism, I think, where now everything means nothing, right? Like there's no such thing as truth anymore, or objective truth. And it's not a very sustainable concept, right? And
but
eventually
they say
people
that,
will
but they don't believe it.
Of course
look
not.
At their discourse. Look at their discourse. They will always be invoking these concepts in their discourse.
Yeah,
You're right.
You're right. And so my question. Okay, so first of all, I want to ask: wouldn't you say that our current morality, our current philosophies, our current systems derive directly out of a natural progression of Western Christianity or European Christianity? In terms of how the Christianity has developed, it's just a mere continuation of Christian history. And in that sense, that postmodernism opens up the opportunity, because postmodernism is putting it, I think, making people reject Christianity entirely, right? And now you have a new epistemology people are searching for, right? And now this opportunity, this is where Islam can replace what Christianity dominated. Right now we think we live in a post-Christian society. I don't think we lived in a post-Christian society. I think we just lived in an alternative Christian society, right?
I mean, I hate to drop names. Nietzsche makes this exact same argument. He says that we still exist according to the shadows of God, and he completely predicts postmodernism as this movement which thinks it's, completely oppositional to Christianity, but he says it's really just a hangover of those same Christian values, what he calls Christian values at its heart. I think he's wrong to label them Christian per se. It more reflects of the way Christianity has interacted with the contingencies of European history, and that kind of, through a lot of chance and a lot of political circumstance, a particular value system has just through contingent chance emerged out of that, and Christianity is one of the causal factors which has caused it. But
even though postmodernism is still a continuation of that, but because the perception of people is a complete rejection of Christianity, that perception, I feel like, opens up people entirely towards new epistemologies, right? Without even realizing they're just continuing a Christian epistemology, whatever. But like that perception is very powerful, right? And it's not entirely logical. It's not necessarily the logical progression, like in terms of not everybody adheres to an ideology logically. So like logically, postmodernism is not necessarily distant from what existed before it, but because of that perception, it impacts them as human beings, and it impacts their limitations as rational human beings, and it kind of causes that cognitive dissonance. This opens up the opportunity to provide something that is not so convoluted, which Islam is very basic and it's very established for 1400 years,
So let me jump in for a second. So there are a lot of actually theorists who have also rejected modernity and found it to be basically anti-human and very problematic. So for example, Eric Vogelin, who I'm a huge fan of and devotee of, really, the German political philosopher, and also Jonathan Gray, or John Gray, excuse me, from United Kingdom. I don't know if you guys are familiar with John Gray. You UK guys, Americans generally are. Yeah. So both of them, and I think John Gray was following Eric Vogelin in this, but both of them said that essentially modernity was a heresy, a Christian heresy, essentially derived from Gnosticism. And so it's not Christianity per se, but it's a strand of Christianity that was declared to be a heresy early on, but essentially took over, the West in a secularized form. And essentially that's focusing, instead of focusing on paradise as the goal, focusing on this world as a goal.
Well, if I may add in there, this is Harris jumping in. There is a lot of work in the field of kind of conceptualizing secularism, which says exactly this. And of course, it builds off the theorists that you mentioned as kind of the originators, in a sense, of this idea.
Yeah.
And that's of Protestantism specifically making secularism and making, in a sense, atheism in the way that we know it possible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's especially because of this whole idea of there being, private religion and public religion, or a very idea of the separation between private and public.
Yeah.
And only in a system where it only matters what you believe in your mind and doing things is completely separate, right? Only in that system could secularism ever exist, where you could say, well, I'm going to, happily have a difference between what thoughts I have in my mind and what I believe in my mind and what I am forced to do in public with other people. For almost all of history, people would have found that idea, just ridiculous. They would have said, well, no, if I believe this in my head, why would I do something else in public?
It's the myth of the secular, right? It's the myth of the secular, this notion that what actually happened was European nation states came up to very kind of contingent agreements with ecclesiastical structures as to who will have power in which spheres. And then they just labeled, to justify this arrangement, they said, well, okay, this group of areas where we happen to have power we'll label profane or temporal, and this area where the church happens to have power, we'll label religious. And they just used this, they just said, okay, sorry, I'm muddling up. It's like 2 a.m. over here. But effectively, what happened was the situation is that because the state happens to have power here, they said, okay, we'll label this group of areas secular and therefore justify the state having power here, because the state should only have power in secular areas. Because the church happens to have power here, we'll label these areas religious and therefore say, well, therefore only the church should have power here. When really this whole divide between secular and religious just reflects the contingent power sharing agreements between ecclesiastical structures and states.
It's a theological continuation of Christianity, right? Where the theological belief now is that religion or God in this situation does not want religion influencing the state apparatus. So this is essentially a theological, and Jeremy McClellan has a great post about this, where Christians basically have relegated their God's role to the government, where now the religion requires them to adhere to the government's laws, where now they're responsible when the government engages in wars overseas. And that's why you see in churches, they promote the army and they promote, these different aspects, these more horrid aspects of secularism, of the secular nation states, right?
Okay.
Because it's a continuation it's just a strand of Christian thought, where now this is a theological belief that I don't believe God has a role in government. Whereas this is inherently counterintuitive to Islam, where we believe God has a role in everything in life, right?
Okay,
and that's our theological belief.
Let me challenge you on that, and this is actually going to get into some of AQ's specialty, which is sources of morality. So I wanted to mention the example of Roger Williams, who was a Baptist religious leader in America before the American Revolution. And he split away he left Massachusetts and founded Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island. And his point of view was that there should be no established church, and that in reality everyone should be able to have the freedom to essentially believe whatever they wanted to believe. And what he said about sources of morality was that he said that the state has no business in enforcing the 10 Commandments, what he called the first table, which is 1 through 5, dealing with there's that you shall have no other God before me, and so on and so on. But the state should have a role in enforcing the second table, which was 6 through 10, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not, and so on. So he actually, he was one of the founders, at least intellectually, of the First Amendment and the American style arrangement, which is very different from the French and the Kemalist and so on and so on. So what I wanted to get into with you guys is a couple things. One is sources of morality, sources of law, and the second thing is America is it is qualitatively different from France. So and if you guys have read the book Two Faces of Liberalism by John Gray, he talks about how liberalism actually has two different sort of manifestations, and which actually are almost diametrically opposed. One is this sort of all penetrating, sort of thing where religion has to be removed from the public square. And then you have in America where it was founded essentially by people who were more religious than the Puritans. They were people who were the Puritans came here rebelling against the Anglican Church in England, and then you had these dissenters who were rebelling against the Puritan Church because they thought they were, more religious than them. And so everyone kind of figured out in America that, well, wait a minute, maybe what we need to do is to stop using the state to try to impose our religious beliefs on others and just come to an arrangement where we're all going to, just essentially have our own way of believing. And that's John Gray says that that's kind of more similar to the millet system that existed under the Ottoman Empire, where you have a state that has no particular role in enforcing religion, and they're autonomous groups. So what would you guys, anyone can jump in here, what would you guys say about the
American? I have a few things to say.
Yeah.
That's actually some great points because, as you mentioned, the sort of bare bones structure of the American government, that it's not meant to create or legislate morality for the people. It sort of devolves that to the people, as opposed to say the French Laïcité or even the Kemalist state. A lot of the issue that we as Muslims have with politics, how do we conceptualize what a state is in our tradition? What are its roles? What are its institutions? So as I mentioned earlier, groups like ISIS, Iran, Hizb Tahrir, where do they put their legislation? All of them put their legislation in a structure similar to the nation state.
Yeah.
For what reason? Where does this come from in our own tradition in terms of fiqh and say how the Abbasid or the Ottomans dealt with the judges and muftis of the empire. And really, I think we need to start looking at a form of politics separate from the state, a form of law grounded in morality that is also separate from the state. And I'm trying to bring in a bit of halakhi analysis in here.
Referring to what
al-Halak. He wrote The Impossible States. Great book. I recommend everyone reads that, if they're trying to talk about politics and a post-nation state, Islamic. Yeah. So I definitely agree that if we were to take inspiration from a model, it would be the American model. Not merely because of, its sort of bare bones structure. So, in Islam, our idea of the state is one where it's an executive power. So, it takes taxes, limited amount, very small amount. It's quite American in its, in that taxes are actually, many of them are considered dhulm. So it's oppression to take taxes from the people. So we have a minimal concept of that. So that is also antithetical to, the nation state of Europe, which, they, more than any other polity in history, they tax their citizens the most heavily. And taxes and war. So defense, basically, keeping the borders safe. And, in the pre-modern era where we did not have, the territorial concept, so borders were fluid, we would expect the structure of the state to be involved in jihad. That would also, be different now because of the pressures of the Westphalian state. So yeah, we need to move out from the totalizing concept of the state that the Europeans have given to us. We need to look back at our own tradition of states. We need to look at other more hands-off nation states such as America. Yeah.
What you said, I know you cited in your example, Hizb ut-Tahrir was something that you kind of lumped in with Iran and ISIS, but from what I've read about them, and when I was studying with them, I found out that they're actually espousing exactly what you said. They want to get rid of the structures that the Western the Western state structure, right? And they want to put in place a model that was more towards like the model of the Abbasids or the Umayyads or even the Khulafa Rashidun. Yeah, that.
From what I've read from their manifestos and their constitution, and I've also seen like their, they've made like these theoretical state structures and so on and so forth. It's very similar to the nation state. I mean, yeah, they'll have extra things like, say, Hisba. That's also another issue, that the idea of enforcing morality. I'm heavily against, states enforcing morality or trying to, formulate it. So, in the West that, yeah.
Doesn't it seem, excuse me, Ismail here, doesn't it seem that one of the biggest problems that, Muslims in our time have by saying, we want to go back to some previous thing is because we're so captured by modernity and by our perspective that we don't even know what it looked like. So that if you read, for example, Ibn Khaldun, he's been criticized by a lot of quote-unquote Islamists because they think he's a secularist. But in reality, what he's describing is just what the how things were done.
Yeah, this is the issue. Okay, we have no idea. Our tradition is just, we've been completely divorced from it. We don't know what's there.
Yeah, can I actually also interject, add on, is that, when you were talking about the U.S. not influencing morality, I mean, I disagree. Just like you said, we don't have our tradition. Part of the reason a lot of people don't know their tradition is because you're not allowed to teach it, right? And this is a way of enforcing morality, enforcing allegiance to a certain
Yeah, I mean, obviously, America's not the perfect example, but compared to France, like France is just crazy. It's
No, I definitely get it. And the U.S. So I think the U.S. theoretically can be a good model. The issue is in practice, it's not, right? And I think that was a big problem because I want to push back against that a little bit, but because when in Egypt after the revolution happened, when Morsi was running for president, and they were trying to rebuild the country, they were trying to rebuild the system, what people kept on asking for is literally, like, if you actually listen to a lot of the demands, they literally wanted a copy-paste of the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, definitely.
And so anything that went against that ended up becoming a power grab, or like this concept of this is the limitations of the state that has to be adhered to. And then they're saying, no, we're revolting against, everything, any foreign influence. But in reality, people are still immensely, the only conception of a state, it's still
it's
based
just
off of the U.S.
Can I fight back against the notion that America is actually like the way that America handles religious freedom and religious diversity is something admirable? Because I think there's two major ways in which, I mean, it's admirable in its own terms within a European context, but I think it has at least two very, very significant differences with the Islamic model and our own history. I mean, I think the first of those is that it relies on this notion that religion can be something which is completely interiorized and privatized.
Yeah. No, not really, actually.
Well, but it doesn't, for instance, allow you to. So the thing about the Islamic model is that you have judges which then enforce your religious law of your religious community and can actually impose it against the adherents. And I think that's a huge world away from anything the American system has, right? In the American
our system is unique. We can't really compare that to, anything that any other civilization has produced.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Which is why I think it's important to make the distinctions with the American system, because no matter how much quote unquote religious freedom you get, you're not going to have the freedom of belonging to a religious community which actually lives by religious law as law rather than religious law as private custom and social norm. Okay. And I think that's really, really significant.
I think actually, sorry, Ismail. I just want to add. I think what Dimashqee is talking about is, in the U.S., I think the most ideal kind of system in the U.S. for Muslims would be a libertarian system, right, where there's a lot more hands off from the government, right, and actually, somebody mentioned the Amish earlier, but the Amish community basically has their own society that they live within, while still living amongst the rest of American society, but they still live in their own pocket where they're left alone.
Also, Orthodox Jews.
Yeah, in New
Orthodox
York,
Jews,
yeah.
In New York,
Mormons.
they have their own police systems and all this stuff in Brooklyn.
But I
So,
would
like,
say,
but
yeah,
no,
so
I
I would-
agree. I'm agreeing with you though.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
generally speaking, I think there's a specific rejection of Islam
Well-
within our current.
Well, okay,
our
so
country.
I would disagree with that. So I would say that the difference is that under the millet system, under the Duma system,
Yeah.
different religious communities are able to live under their own socio-political
You're
orders.
right. Yeah, no, I agree.
Under
with
their
you.
own socio-political orders, their own legal orders, their own socio-political orders. Under
That
the
is the
American
difference,
system,
But
If I may jump in,
that's what a true libertarian system would look like.
you're still
if I may,
I'm sorry. Let me just. I want to give a couple examples of something. I was in Macedonia in '99, and I was visiting the Albanian community there, and the brothers were telling me, "Do you see this door on our masjid? We want to paint it, and they won't give us permission to paint. The government won't give us permission to paint the door, you know." And it was just the weirdest thing. I was like, well, why don't you just paint it? And they're like, well, no, if we paint it, you know, they'll come on and they'll fine us and they'll take the door and they'll shut the masjid down. And it was the weirdest thing. And actually, churches have to go through the same thing, of course, but, you know, in Macedonia, at that time, the churches would get permission, whereas the mosques would not. But, you know, also in the United States, I have a friend of mine, he's a Tunisian, and he had just come here from Tunis. And we were looking for a masjid to pray in. Or I was telling him there's not really too many masajid in D.C. And he's like, well, why don't you just ask the mayor to make one? You know, and I was like, ask the mayor? What are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, just file a petition with the mayor and ask him for a masjid. And I'm like, that's not how it works. You know, someone just build a masjid. That's what it is. You know, I mean, of course we know the Ground Zero, you know, fiasco and all that type of stuff. But in general, in America, if someone tries to block you from building a masjid, so for example, with like saying, oh, well, zoning and blah, 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 then you take him to court, and the Department of Justice here and Catholic groups, along with Muslim groups, filed a suit, most famously recently in New Jersey, and won like a multi-million-dollar settlement for the mosque because the government tried to block the mosque from being built. So, or for example, and I'm sorry to use one other, keep talking about like, so for example, in Austria, you know, when they banned the niqab, I was arguing with this guy on Twitter from Austria saying that that's crazy. That why is the government even sticking its? It's one thing to say, well, you can't wear niqab if you're going to have an ID or if you're in a court proceeding, something like that, so they think you can see your face. But why does it matter to the government what whether someone can see your face or not? And I quoted for him the First Amendment, but I didn't tell him it was the First Amendment. And I said, what is this? I said, what do you think about this statement? He says, that's a very dangerous statement. You know, and I'm that's our first
different
amendment.
political cultures.
Harris here. I completely agree with Ismail, and I think responding to AQ, I think when we are mentioning the United States as a better model or a good model or a more tolerable model, I think that was more in
Theory.
comparison to other secular modern nation states, and not compared to a different
America is definitely like one of the worst offenders against Muslims and Islam in general.
Yeah. And I think to Ismail's point, and to the credit of the the way that the United States the rights and the freedoms that are still upheld. I think one of the most beneficial ones, kind of in the way that liberalism and secularism has manifested itself there, is that the state has still kept away from being an arbiter of what symbols mean. And I mean that in the sense of, in France, you can't, they get to decide, the court gets to decide when your beard is a religious beard and when your beard is not a religious beard. Yeah. They get to decide on an individual basis. You are wearing that beard because you are trying to, demonstrate that you're Muslim. Whereas in the United States, and I think in Canada as well, it's a broadly North American tradition, the court will not take that judgment. They will say, well, we can't decide what something else means when someone else does it. And I think that's one of the big differences and benefits of the way that secularism has manifested in North America, which is that the courts and the law does not arbitrate on what systems mean or what symbols mean.
But I'd argue.
benefit or a harm?
No, I'd argue it's a tool that is easily used to manipulate Muslims in a way that pacifies them, right? And in the sense of like, you have it great here, and now you just don't cross this specific line, but this line that they have created is a line where they can harm Muslims immensely, right?
Can you give me an example? Because I'm not sure.
Okay, so for example, I'll take freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, is protected. Blah 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 blah. It's only protected insofar as your speech or what you're doing actually becomes somewhat threatening to the structures that be in some way, shape, or form. So I'm gonna give the example of the Holy Land Five, right, which was this charity group of 5 Muslims. It was kind of like a zakat fund, national zakat fund. And they got accused of sending money to terrorists overseas, and there was no evidence of this whatsoever. But the court was participatory in jailing these people, and so it is dangerous when Muslims actually do take our religion to the most logical conclusions. Or to the most to the
logical end.
It's a logical end to how we're supposed to practice, right? And so we're not allowed to practice our deen in a way that it actually benefits us on a more material level. Once that starts happening, that's when you start become threatening. And it's not just for Muslims. It happens to other groups of people as well. It happens to, the black community. It happens to a lot. You know about the MOVE bombings. I don't know if you know about that. The FBI literally went in Philadelphia and bombed a bunch of houses, where they were doing food drives and providing services for poor people in the community. The Black Panther Party was all killed off. A lot of black leaders were jailed or killed off because once their practice, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., once they started saying things or revolutionary, some stuff that are actually revolutionary in the way that we're talking about right now, that's when they became a threat to the state, and that's when their rights don't matter anymore.
Right.
And so the rights only exist insofar as they can exist. They're allowed to exist. So it's not a mercy. It's more so a form of repression, but an illusion of freedom, right? It's
I would strongly disagree with that. I think these are two separate things. I think one of these is the willingness. One issue, which is what I was specifically referring to, is the willingness of the state to basically, to kind of quote the literature, to act as theologian. And the other is the state deciding its own boundaries of coercion, and at what level will it tolerate dissent. I don't think those are exactly two of the same things. They can be, but on the other hand, the question is, it is not a matter of, it remains in the North America that the state does not, whatever its boundaries of coercion are, or when it tells you, hey, actually you can't say that or you can't do that, that's a bit different than them saying what practices specifically in a more metaphysical sense constitute what someone else believes. So, you're mentioning, specific acts of organizing that they can say you can't do that. Whereas in other parts of the world, in France, in Turkey, across continental Europe, they would say that, if you pray out on the street, that is an act of defiance. That is defying the state. That is, you are doing that because, this such and such ideological reason. Whereas I don't think I don't think that is present in the United States and in Canada, where they can ascribe to the same level. Of course, the state can always ascribe, actions to you. That is what, criminal justice is. That's, they say you're guilty or you're not, or, this is a crime or that's not a crime. But I think to the extent that it exists, in the rest of the world, I think North America, they don't have this tradition of ascribing beliefs onto people's actions.
I think it has the capacity to when it needs to, when it wants. It's not necessarily that it's actively doing so. But I get what you're saying.
This is a really interesting discussion. I wanted to so let's shift gears because I ran into a huge let's say, like a train wreck when I came out and defended Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya about some issue. I defended him against an article that someone had written about that no one should take from him because he works for UAE, and UAE is this evil thing and all this type of stuff. And I said, look, you shouldn't say that we can't take from a scholar just because he happens to work for UAE. So we got into this huge Twitter war about it, and someone told me, even brothers that I was, familiar, that I used to dialogue with in the 90s online and stuff, who back then were saying, look, you can't blame Sheikh bin Baz and you can't blame Sheikh ibn Uthaymeen for things that the government of Saudi Arabia does. We have to take their benefit and pardon them or whatever, and maybe they have their own reasons for why they're affiliating with these governments or whatever. But that seems to have all gone out the window. And some of those brothers now we're saying, that was back in the day. We don't believe that anymore. We've changed. Now, we're holding these sheikhs accountable for. So what I'm leading up to is that someone said, well, it's a wala wal bara issue. If you, if you're not fully for Qatar. And in other words, it's an aqeedah issue. You have a defect in your aqeedah if you are not a Qatar supporter and you do not hate the governments of Saudi Arabia and UAE. And furthermore, by default, that you do not then reject the scholars who are affiliated with KSA, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and UAE. So let me ask you guys this. What is this right? Is this actually an aqeedah issue that if you don't, fully throw your weight behind Qatar, then you're deviant in the religion?
Not at all. Just.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, I don't know if I need to renew my shahada or what.
No. So the issue between Qatar and UAE is that we can split the Arab world as it is into sort of two spheres of influence. After the Arab Spring, so we've got the mostly Islamist opposition, and they've mostly been supported by Qatar and Turkey. And then on the other hand, we have the sort of ancien regime, the old order, so the tyrants like Mubarak, Zinedine Ali, Gaddafi, and all these kind of old guard types, and they were supported by the Saudi UAE axis. And so what has happened is that because Qatar wants its own sort of foreign policy influence separate from the Saudi UAE axis, Saudi and the UAE have sort of ganged up on Qatar, and so it's like a sort of Islamist opposition versus a secularist, tyrannical old guard that we see in the Arab world. And so what people have done is they've just applied this, haq versus batil sort of division, that Qatar is, the vanguard of, the Islamic opposition versus the secular American slaves of the UAE and Saud. And, I do believe that fundamentally, UAE and Saud are consistently working against the interests of the faith and the Muslim people. And I do believe that Qatar and Turkey are, they're far more supportive of the aspirations of, Islamist parties, and by extension of that, the role of Islam in politics and society. But once again, this comes to our previous discussion about the division between state and morality, between politics and the state. Is it right that we say, so-and-so person, because of his association with a state, which is all-encompassing anyway, that we then, excommunicate them? So unless it's like a scholar, let's say he comes out and he says, the army of Al-Sisi has the right to slaughter these opposition protesters, then okay, fair enough. That's, that's a matter of Muslim blood being spilt by a scholar who is, endorsing tyrants. But, Bin Baya, he isn't doing that directly. And, the UAE, their operations across the Muslim world, most of it is clandestine. So, it's not something clear that we can judge upon, even though, the intelligence reports that are flying around suggest that they're up to, assassinations and coups in half the Muslim world. But But yeah, this is a political issue.
I
wouldn't make it necessarily an Aqidah issue, mainly because the lines are not clear at all.
I think I can see where people make it an Aqidah issue because of those countries and their relation to Palestine in particular, right? And to Al-Aqsa and to the liberation of the Palestinian land, right? For the Muslims. I think that's why people turn it into an Aqidah issue, because you're actively working against one of the holiest masajid and our deen, one of the first Qibla, Al-Aqsa, you're working against that, then that seems like an Aqidah issue for people. It's like somebody working against the Kaaba almost, like how can you support somebody who actively is against the Muslims taking the Kaaba or maintaining the Kaaba, right? And that's why people look at it as an Aqidah issue. But I'm not a scholar, I'm not gonna talk about whether it's an Aqidah issue or not. But I will say that when somebody does have an association with the UAE, or they have an association with the Saudi government directly, and those governments seem to favor them for whatever reason, or the Egyptian government even, or Syrian government, or Assad's government, this should let out a lot of red flags, because I think people need to be careful with those scholars and their associates, and the U.S. government too, or any other government in general, because that means that person has some interests, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be malicious interests, for whatever reason they're aligned with them, or they're in congruence with them, or they may be partnered with them on something, but because of that conflict of interest, and the fact that states actively, nation state model itself is actively antithetical towards Islamic like edicts or Islamic orthodoxy, and our understanding of Islamic politics in general, then we have to take what they say with a grain of salt. And I'd personally suggest to people not to take politics from such scholars, because they're not trustworthy in that situation to provide whatever the reason is. I'm not going to judge their intentions behind it. I'm not going to say, they're doing it for money or what have you. Allahu alam. But for the sake of that person themselves, I'd say, avoid taking politics from them, political knowledge from them, avoid taking like that kind of knowledge from them. Because
how far would you extend this principle though? Because for instance, in Syria, a lot of the scholars said, you shouldn't, no matter how cruel and monstrous Assad is, nothing is worth, there's going to be no good that's going to come out of taking arms against him, no matter how bad it gets. Now, that's a pragmatic judgment that may or may not be right. But would you also, for instance, exclude them too?
But if they have direct connections with the Assad government, then this is obviously a clear conflict of interest.
Well, how can you assess
which is what a lot of the scholars did.
How can you assess that?
A lot of the scholars
they're
did
given
have
stipends. They're given endorsement. Like in a state like Syria, the Sunni ulama were extremely censored. They weren't allowed to talk about a lot of issues of Tawheed, even so the basic elements of Islam, because it would cause political issues for the government. There were certain elements of fiqh that were not allowed to be talked about. So in Syria, you could judge the how close a scholar was to the regime by how free he was in talking about whatever issue he wanted to talk about. And so, there's a certain level you reach high enough where you're able to, go on tours freely, you're able to talk about topics freely. You're seen regularly in meetings and stuff with officials.
But this gets into dangerous territory.
But the thing is,
that's the problem. This is the problem. The lines are not clear.
Yeah, but AQ, but I'd say AQ in the Arab world at least, it is not the same as other nation states where they recognize, they understand that people there have a deep connection with Islam, and so they need to monopolize the Islam, right? They need to monopolize the narrative around Islam. So it doesn't make sense for them to let majority of scholars freely go. So most of the time you could tell, because most of the time they appoint scholars themselves. They're the ones who endorse the scholars. They're the ones who promote the Grand Mufti of this country, the Grand Mufti of that country, right? If a tyrant is appointing you as a Grand Mufti, he doesn't fear what you have to say for a reason. There's obviously a conflict of interest.
But without naming specific names, it does seem that the people you're indicting with this now become like some of the chief ulema of the entire Al-Sunnah world the entire Sunni world, right? The chief
You have their own
Ash'ari
students,
scholars.
but you have their own students who will speak out against them for doing this. It's not. So it's not.
But
It's
also,
not like
I don't think it's a fair assessment of their judgment or of their intention, because as you mentioned, they're under control. So I don't,
I'm not judging their intentions.
In some,
the wisdom behind taking these very specific issues from them, knowledge from them on these issues. It's not, you're not really taking it from somebody who has the freedom to actually say. I mean, it's just about being wise.
But that's a separate issue.
The Prophet says, the Muslim is not one who is easily fooled. Right? And this is you can't just trust a scholar who has the favor of the government to be honest about addressing. This is a different issue, though. The government. This is
a different issue from the original issue, which is is there something faulty with their, should you not take other matters of deen from these people?
No, I never said that. Like, for example,
I know, but that's what the kind of original
you just have to be cautious. You have to be cautious.
That's a knee-jerk reaction by a lot of people. They just want to excommunicate them, as a, just blanket. They're not Muslim, blah, blah, blah.
Well, also, they have their lives and their families to be worried about as well. I don't think it's fair to, imply that they're they're cowards or stooges or anything like that, because we don't know what pressures are on them and, why they make the decisions that they make.
The issue at the end of the day is that we lack power. We lack community power as well to protect our scholars from falling victim to. They need a support system as well, right? They're in a very vulnerable position. You can't act there are plenty of scholars who've spoken out against the government and they got targeted by the government. They got hanged, they got killed, whatever. Like they're easy targets to go after.
But do you not think that God protects the Sunni world, though, at least to some minimal extent, that he wouldn't let some of our most renowned ulema, who you are specifically indicting here, all fall into the kind of errors that you're claiming them to fall into? I'm
not saying they're falling into error. Maybe the tyrant themselves says you're the Grand Mufti. They have no choice to accept it. But I'm saying is you just have to be wise about taking especially political knowledge from them and what they say politically. But what if a scholar justifies, for example, the U.S. opening an army base in Saudi to go bomb Iraq, this is obviously somebody you shouldn't take political knowledge from. And there's very obvious examples of this happening over and over. The issue with the UAE is that the UAE is more subversive, and their form of manipulation or using the religion to manipulate, or I would say manufacture consent. And people should read that book, by the way. Manufacturing Consent. It has nothing to do with this.
Chomsky.
I know Chomsky, but it's a very good book that kind of addresses kind of this topic, how the state manufactures consent. But in the same way, these states manufacture consent to ulama and to the religion.
Sure, of course they do. But then a distinction becomes when they make very strong fiqh arguments or aqeedah arguments for what they say. So you took a really obvious example about the military base where it's very hard for them to even offer good arguments there. But there's so much that aren't as extreme as that, which really are extremely blurry. Now, as laypersons, we can flip through their arguments and these seem extremely compelling. But you're saying we should just reject that because they're politically suspect, these seemingly incredibly compelling fiqh arguments that they're making. I'm not saying you have to agree with those arguments, but to just automatically kind of say, well, these are just politically compromised, so we can't take from them.
Well, I'm saying it's not trustworthy.
If you're a layman, you shouldn't be making that judgment anyway.
I'm saying it's a conflict of interest, and you should be wise about who, when you take your knowledge from. Right? So like during the Southern Civil War, you have the Grand Mufti of Syria, who's a Sunni, saying X, Y, Z. I'm not going to trust what he's saying because obviously Assad doesn't want people revolting against him.
But hold on. So let me give two examples. The Mufti of Saudi Arabia back in like 2000, I don't know, 4 or 5 or something like, maybe 5. He gave a fatwa saying that the Saudi people should no longer go out for jihad anywhere because back in the day they used to authorize jihad by their citizens traveling for jihad. So, for example, to the Afghanistan in the first war, or against the Soviets, and then Bosnia. And the Saudis were very, very active in Bosnia. The government and the people went to volunteer there. And then the Saudi Mufti gives this fatwa, and he says why. He says because now deviation, and especially like the Al Qaeda and Khawarij mentality had become so widespread that they were afraid that their citizens would go out there, get influenced by this, come back and start blowing stuff up, which is actually happening. So someone could say, oh, well, of course the Mufti of Saudi Arabia is going to say that because the Saudi government are tyrants and they don't want people to go out for jihad. But in reality, there's actually a very strong point there. Now, one other thing you mentioned, Sheikh al-Bouti, but
exactly.
he was saying things that actually the Saudi government said, and not Saudi government, the Saudi ulama were saying, and you could say, oh, well, they're Saudi ulama, so therefore they're going to say that. But they were also saying, many ulama were saying that the result of rebelling against Assad is going to be much worse than any benefit that can come about. And I challenge anyone on this podcast to say that there isn't at least a very strong argument that perhaps it would have been better never to have been.
Well, that was disingenuous from Sheikh Ramadan Bouti. That was disingenuous.
The reaction of the people. It wasn't something that they chose to do. Sure, exactly. I'll tell you something. At the beginning, in 2011, when the Syrians went out, they weren't protesting against the regime. They weren't protesting against Assad. They had the Syrian flags. They had Bashar's portraits in their protest. They were asking for reforms.
Yes.
Then the kidnapping started. The shooting started. They would kidnap and torture kids and dump their bodies in front of their parents' houses. The rapes began. So what happened was the people then demanded, the overthrow of the regime. Government obviously reacts to that in an even bigger fashion. So the killing gets worse. Airplanes come into it. So districts get bombed. Obviously, at that point, what are you going to do? You're just going to stop? By the way, in Syria, this is not the first time, this was not an anomaly, an attack.
Yes.
It's part of a long series of systematic pogroms of the active Sunni population that has resented the Alawite control of the states, the seizure of our, assets, and the marginalization of the Sunni communities in favor of the Alawites, for example. So when we discuss the debate over whether it was right to rebel or not, there was no choice in the first place. And I think a lot of it, in fact, was provoked by the Assad regime because they wanted an excuse for even a greater bloodshed. But there's something here that's missing, and that's...
We're talking about whether or not the fatwa of many ulama that in political situations like this, can be taken or not taken. And all I'm saying
Ismail, when you said Ramadan al-Bouti, I think a lot of the people ignored him specifically because he had such a close alliance with the Assad regime for years.
He shouted out of the Umayyad mosque
so he was,
by Syrians.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
When he was trying to give a Jummah khutbah in Damascus, when the protests were starting, he was basically booed out of the masjid by the people because they knew that, he was going to say, don't protest against the regime, etc., etc.
Yeah. And I just want to add that caveat that Sheikh Ramadan Bouti contributed an enormous amount of knowledge to the Muslim world, the Islamic scholarship world. We're not taking anything away from that, but we're just talking about the reason why people didn't give his words of advice of not rebelling against the ruler much credibility.
And also, I have to add on to Dimashqee because if you're giving a fatwa and your fatwa is completely divorced, which is what Dimashqee is alluding to, from the reality on the ground. If I'm over here,
doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make. If I'm over here in America and I'm saying the biggest issue Muslims have now is that they don't have beards. Who the hell is going to listen to me? And then I'm gonna make a fatwa based on that. I have no connection to the reality on the ground whatsoever. Then nobody's going to listen to me. And in this situation, obviously, it's a more extreme example. If I'm saying, oh yeah, you shouldn't rebel, and you have army men coming to your home and massacring your wife and children, and one of our greatest jihads is protecting your property, protecting your family as well, and to tell them to just allow it to happen, how can you expect people to accept that kind of fatwa, which has no bearing on the reality? There was no calling for Assad to stop killing people. It's telling people, don't fight Assad back. What choice do I have if I'm if today white supremacists came and decided to go massacre all the Muslims, we're just gonna let them massacre us? Like that? That's the same choice that these people had in Syria. What do you do in that situation? It's speaking from an ivory tower, and I think this is when you look at the merits of the fatwa as well. You look at the merits of what's being said. If the merits are not consistent with the reality, with the facts, why would I accept what this sheikh is saying?
Well, I think you're eliding timelines a little bit there, because you're there's something to be said about the pragmatism of saying don't rebel in before rebellion breaks out in earnest, and people who say it afterwards, and again, it's not about
But it wasn't a rebellion. That's what I'm trying to say. It was defense. It was self-defense. That's what it was. It wasn't like the French Revolution. We're gonna go to King Louis's castle.
Well,
whatever,
I mean, everyone.
That's not what happened. What happened was people were being massacred. They had no choice. You're gonna die. You're either gonna live or you're gonna die. That was the choice that they had. It was not don't fight and you can live in peace. Even now today, while the revolution is dying and there's not many very many people fighting, people are still being massacred in Assad-controlled areas who opposed Assad before. So when we talk about this sheikh's fatwa or that sheikh's fatwa, and should we not accept it because of the government? Yes, I think if they have a direct connection with the government that's oppressing people, there's a very suspect. Their fatwa was automatically suspect, and I don't think it's wrong to say that.
I don't agree with that. I would say that should be another element that you should consider, but I don't think it should be considered inherently suspect, and that's because the merits of what they're saying may still end up being true or not.
Well,
true.
I'm saying most of the time their merits are not even true to begin with, because it's not consistent with the reality, right? And it is.
But that's not inherent to their link to a government necessarily.
More often than not,
but that depends on the political structure we're talking about. And now we're talking about the Arab world. You don't get an opinion that is different from what the state sanctions.
Exactly.
So it would be inherently an issue if you were connected to such a high level with such a body, right? Because the deal you make with them, it's like a deal with it's a Faustian bargain. You say to them, I'm going to limit myself in this and this. I'm going to be influenced in this and this to be able to do that. So if a scholar like Al-Bouti goes to the government and he has a high position with the government, he's had to concede some things. He's had to accept a particular bargain. And we know the political structure of the Arab world. We know the repression that is inherent to their apparatus. So for me, in that particular context, it would be, I'm with Hossam on this one. It's quite apparent.
I like when you agree with me, Dimashqee. It doesn't happen often, but when it does,
one of the few times. Anything outside of American politics.
Okay, so we could probably go on for another 3 hours, and we can actually move this conversation to Twitter or. But anyway, I just want to say, what an amazing opportunity we have. Basically. The whole of intellectual Muslim Twitter here on our and probably the people on Twitter are wondering what the hell's going on. Why is this blackout of intelligence on Muslim Twitter? Are we boycotting or what? What's going on? But anyway,
are we cool to put your guys' Twitter handle on the description?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we'll do that for the listeners so that they can keep in touch with you guys. I know a lot of our listeners are really passionate about these subjects, and they can learn a little bit more about you guys as well on Twitter. And I know we had a whole lot of other things that we wanted to talk about on this podcast, but we weren't able to get to. But inshallah, we'll bring you guys on again. I love this roundtable. This was fantastic, and something that a lot of Islamo nerds like us love to talk about. And I hope you guys had a good time as well.
Oh yeah, thank you for having us. It was fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll definitely do this on the regular, inshallah.
All right, so Ismail's going to get married tomorrow. Any words of advice? Any married guys over here? Any parting words of advice for him?
We're all young as hell.
Hey, you can tell they're young because they know everything. They've got the solutions to everything.
Ismail throwing shade at us right now.
Ismail, we got to check on these guys when they're 40 and see if they're still down for the cause.
Inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair, Ikhwan, for coming on, and inshallah we'll be really looking forward to have you back, inshallah.
Yeah.
Inshallah.
Thank you.
All right.
Assalamu
So for my
and hopefully I'll be more coherent next time if it's earlier in the day.
No,
Yeah.
we really need to get.
Yeah.
We need to get to Ghazali and his sources of morality. That's what I really want to do, because you and I were going back and forth about that a little bit. So
Yeah, I think it was more I misunderstood you though, rather than anything else. But
alhamdulillah.
All right.
We should divide the philosophy from the politics, because the politics is quite chunky in itself.
Yeah, I think the politics is really emotional, more so than philosophy.
But it'll still really interest the listeners.
No, I think this is a good talk. Like I was listening to everybody else.
I liked it. I enjoyed
Hey,
it as well.
let me wrap this up, and then we can talk after I hit stop on the record. I don't want you guys to say something and incriminate yourself. All right, cool. So for questions, comments, and concerns, reach out to excuse me. This is why Mahin actually handles this. For questions, comments, and concerns, you can email us at themadmamluks@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter. We're also on Facebook and Instagram as well. So for my co-hosts, Hossam, who else? Ahmed, Haris, and MK?
Yes.
AQ.
I'm sorry. I totally butchered that. All right. So for my co-host, Ismail, thank you for listening. Assalamu alaikum.